Hello, everyone, and welcome to this YouTube video on the archetypes and the myths of Virgo. My name is Sean Klinkner, and I am a astrologer and the founder of WisdomTree Astrology. I'm a card-carrying Virgo Rising, and so I'm really excited today to dive in with you into the wonderful archetypes and the myths that are associated with the sign of Virgo. It's an amazing sign, and I'm looking forward to doing more of these deep dives into the mythology of the signs to help you grow in your understanding of the zodiac. So, as we get started, I think it would be really great to take some time to offer some gratitude. Um, I'm a firm believer that it's really important for us to acknowledge the people that are our teachers, those who've come before us, who've done incredible research and given great thought and contemplation to the work of astrology. And I just want to offer my special gratitude to three individuals. The very first is Adam Ellenboss. Adam Ellenboss is my teacher and mentor at Nightlight Astrology. I'm currently studying with Adam at the Nightlight School and have really enjoyed and learned so much from him. He's definitely an amazing mentor. I also want to offer gratitude to Liz Green, who Liz is a well-known author of many books and is recognized for her research into the particular myths of astrology. She's a talented astrologer, and some of the insights and the things that I'm going to be talking about today have come from Liz's work. And so I want to offer a special gratitude to Liz for being a pioneer and for kind of opening up some of the amazing sacred storytelling that gives us insight into the zodiac and into astrology. Lastly, I want to offer some gratitude to Austin Coppock. Austin is also a talented author, astrologer, and speaker who is known for his work on the decans of astrology. And I'm also going to be teaching a little bit from some of his work today on the decans. And so thank you to these teachers, and I want to just give full acknowledgement for their work as it has given me insight and inspiration for my talk today. So let's start off by talking about the sign of Virgo. The zodiac sign of Virgo is one of two signs that are ruled by Mercury. It typically is a part of the season from August 23rd to September 22nd. And that takes us seasonally right up until the autumn equinox. The sign of Virgo is a feminine earth sign, meaning that there is a receptive quality to it, that it is uh, first and foremost, it takes in energy. And if you think about earth as an element, earth sort of takes in things, it absorbs things. There's definitely a yin quality to it. The sign of Virgo is a double-bodied sign. What does that mean? People use some of these strange terms that are associated with astrology. You might have heard it referred to as a mutable sign. What double-bodied means is that it has two natures. And in ancient astrology, it referred to signs that were really transitional between seasons. And we have a number of them. Gemini, Virgo, Sagittarius, Pisces are all part of these double-bodied signs. We could go into that a little bit more, but today I want to stay focused on Virgo. But being a double-bodied sign basically means that the sign carries both the fixed energy of the season that it belongs to, and then it begins to incorporate transitional or initiatory energy, bringing about the next season. So for Virgo, we have a sign that has some quality of embodiment of the fixed energy of summer, as well as the initiatory energy of autumn. And so you will find these qualities associated with Virgo. Virgo was also the exaltation sign of Mercury. And in the ancient astrology, um, each of the planets had signs that they ruled, and that was a quality of power and resource that they were very dignified in. But they were also had places in the zodiac where they had a special kind of dignity or a boost of dignity. And for Mercury, it's its own sign of Virgo. So in the sign of Virgo, Mercury is not only comfortable in its sign of rulership, it's also got this exaltation in the sign of Virgo, and it's a very strong place for Mercury. So let's talk about the four mythological archetypes that I'm going to be exploring today. Um, these are archetypes that, in my research, I feel like are very prominent with the sign of Virgo. However, there's probably a few more that could be integrated into this, but today for this video, I'm going to be focusing on four primary archetypes. These archetypes come from the cultural associations with the sign of Virgo, the constellation of Virgo, and the fixed stars that belong to it. It also comes from the decans of Virgo and the Greek myths and the legends that are associated with the sign of Virgo. The four mythological archetypes we're going to be visiting about today are the Harvest Maiden, the Virgin, the Cunning Blacksmith, and the Maiden of Morality. Let's start with the Harvest Maiden. Here in the Harvest Maiden archetype, we see the archetype that we are probably the most familiar with. The imagery here is of a maiden carrying a sheaf of wheat, and a key part of the Harvest Maiden archetype is derived from the actual constellation of Virgo and the fixed stars of Spica and Vindamatrix, which is a lesser star. In the Harvest Maiden archetype, we have a number of different associations with this archetype. We have something that reflects kind of the fertility of the earth and harvest time, the four seasons of the earth, which we're going to explore a little bit later, and into the mythology of that in the myth of the next archetype. Also, just an attunement to the cycles of the earth. There's also something here that speaks to a woman who is in full ownership of her body and was not the property of anyone. In ancient times, it was a very patriarchal kind of society. And in many cases, women did not have um, status. It depends on the culture and which part of the world you were living in. But it was very uncommon for women to be business owners or to be people who managed things due to the patriarchal quality of the society. And the Harvest Maiden is really an archetype that is very diligent and industrious. She manages the land, she tends to it with care. And in Virgo, it really stands out as a part of the archetype that there's a quality of independence. The sign of Virgo could signify an unmarried woman or a woman who was unattached, or perhaps even a woman who retained a quality of independence and agency in spite of attachment. You will find that quality often in Virgos, regardless of whether they are male or female. There's this not not to say that Virgos are always destined to be single, but even those who find partnership and marriage, that there is a strong need, is a part of the sign of Virgo from this archetype that really relates to kind of the maintaining of personhood and that being very important, and them finding ways to stay differentiated while also being attached. Um, The Harvest Maiden archetype is also one that has a deep reverence and connection to the cycles and the seasons of the earth. There's a recognition that there are patterns and ways that nature and creation works to support us. And there's a sacredness and a kind of intuitive attunement to that that's associated with the sign of Virgo. And the harvest maiden in particular works with the fertility and the seasons of the earth to produce abundance that sustains us through the dark and the cold and winter months. One of the things that I think is important for us to consider as we look at the harvest maiden archetype is the influence of the fixed stars that belong to this constellation. One of the foremost fixed stars that is recognizable in the harvest maiden constellation is the fixed star Spica. It's one of the most recognized signs and one of the brightest stars in the sky in the constellation of Virgo. And Spica has connotations of brilliance. It is in the charts of other people who have aspects with Spica, it can signify not only brilliance, but also just talent, people who are luminaries, people who bring light and insight into things. And so there's really a quality of intelligence that is subtly referenced here in the archetype of Virgo. Vendomiatrix was also a fixed star in the constellation that was lesser known. It was also referred to as the vintager. And the imagery here is of a person harvesting grapes from the grapevine. And so again, we kind of have this affirmation of um, someone who's preparing for harvest time. And I think this leads me to probably one of the most significant things from which we derive the symbolism of Virgo, in that it's the astronomical time of year. So just like I mentioned, the season of Virgo in the previous slide, the season of Virgo carries us from the time of the heat of summer, where we have that fixed, high, warm time of energy where the sun is still very bright and hot, and that energy is just pouring into the land, and it's giving the heat and the light that's necessary to bring crops to a full fruition. And then we stretch that season right up until the time of the fall equinox. And the fall equinox is a time of equal day and equal night. And it has to do with the path of the sun as it moves down and moves towards the Tropic of Capricorn, and it becomes lower in the sky. The sign of Libra was known as the fall of the sun, and that's because the day diminished and the amount of hours of darkness increased. It's why Saturn is exalted in the sign of Libra. And we find that Saturn, who is associated with darkness, begins to take the stage as kind of the Lord of Darkness. So Virgo brings us right up to that threshold of equal day and equal night and the reign of the sun ending. And so there's this sense of liminality that comes with the harvest maiden archetype. There's the sense that in the body and in the mind and in the spirit, we're preparing for darkness. We are preparing for a time when darkness will rise and increase, that the world will become colder, harsher, more challenging, more adverse to deal with. And so the impulse of the harvest maiden is to make good use of the time and to make a detailed and meticulous effort to bring in the harvest so that we are ready for the dark. It's really, really beautiful, some of the ways that the seasonality that each of the zodiac signs actually gives us a sense of the nature of that particular sign from the astronomical timing of the season. So let's talk about some of the qualities that we might associate from the harvest maiden archetype and myths. We see with this archetype the inclination to plan and to carry deep intention and detail orientation. There is this meticulous effort to both sow the crop, nurture the crop, harvest the crop, and then bring all of the harvest in so that we are ready. There's this internal kind of urgency, and some people might even call Virgo a little bit high strung because they are constantly thinking about we've got to be ready, we've got to be prepared. There's an anticipation of the darkness coming that is inherent in the sign. And that is because Virgo knows that the change of season is coming and that the sun will only be in the sky for a certain amount of time and that that light is diminishing. And as lights diminish, plants stop growing, that there's a risk of rain, there's a risk of cold temperatures that could kill the harvest. And so we have to maximize the day. We have to maximize the harvest so that we can survive the winter. There's also this quality with Virgo of not desiring to be caught unprepared. That quality of planning, that quality of detail orientation, the desire to account for every little thing is part of this desire to be prepared, to be well stocked, to be well resourced, so that we aren't worrying in a time of year where there's lack of resources. And so there's this deep commitment to preparation. And with that deep commitment to preparation comes vigor, comes this steadfast determination to be resilient in the face of the darkness. There's also, like I mentioned, because of the attunement to the earth and to the seasons, there's this quality about the harvest maiden where there's an abiding reverence for an attunement to the sacredness of nature and divine law. There is this appreciation for how generous and abundant the earth is. And with Virgos, I think for those of us that are a part of spiritual traditions, there is this amplification or maybe a depth to this quality of reverence for nature and sacredness of nature. But I would say for just the everyday kind of common aspect of what you might see with this is you might see this reverence for the sacredness of nature showing up in everyday humans with significant Virgo placements, being like things like, I love being outside. I love being in my garden. I love going on hikes. Nature is my church. You know, these kinds of things. There is this sense that when I walk in the earth, that the earth itself is the temple that I walk in. And that reverence, that sense of being in alignment with, that sense of appreciating what is all around me is very, very much associated with the sign of Virgo. With Virgo, there's also this desire for organization, efficiency, and a dislike of waste. If you can imagine someone who's preparing for the adversities of winter, I mean, we are a little bit immune to this right now because in Western society, it's just a trip to the grocery store, right? But in actuality, when you are living off of the land, you are dependent upon your livestock. You are dependent upon the timing of the seasons and the harvest. And with that, uh, because you are dependent upon it, if something goes awry, like an early frost, or if there's a drought, or if there is early rains that begin to, prevent tomatoes from ripening, for example, um, there's this sense of urgency to not lose anything. And um, with that intentionality, there's also this real dislike for waste that Virgos have. Like, don't waste that. Don't throw that away. Every little bit is precious. A little bit of waste over and over and over adds up to a lot. And so they can be sometimes very concerned over waste and small things. Um, with Virgo, there is this enjoyment of hard work and daily rituals. There's this recognition that we do what we have to do to bring in the harvest. And there's this love of rhythm They're an earth sign, so they're very there's a quality of embodiment that's associated with Virgo, and chores and taking care and cultivating things. Um, and I think because of the seasonality of Virgo, we also see this kind of recognition that their life is temporal, that nature is unpredictable. And you could wake up one morning and there's an early frost, and all of a sudden, like half of your plants have died, and you're scrambling to bring in, what can be salvaged because you were anticipating maybe another couple of weeks of good growth time, even though the temperatures are growing colder. Um, there's this recognition that life is temporary and that there are limits of time, and that contributes to that urgency of being watchful, being ready, and not taking anything for granted. Um, I think that the part of Virgo that recognizes it, it re-emphasizes that desire to not be caught unprepared. It's the desire to overcome even challenges, and because the heart of the harvest maiden is that we be resilient in the face of change. Like I mentioned with the fixed star spica, the harvest maiden is associated with brilliance, cultivation of knowledge, retaining knowledge. Think about the ways that societies pass down rituals and things that related to the preservation of food. Like, who taught the first people to grind up wheat and make bread? Who taught people how to preserve food and to ferment things as a means of preservation and also supporting the body's digestion? Interestingly, Virgo rules the digestion and the abdomen, and in that, we see, the desire to support things like health. So there is wisdom, practical knowledge, harvesting of lessons, teaching lessons, cultivating knowledge and wisdom around how do we do this. Um, and like I mentioned, there is this quality of independence that we will find with Virgo around this desire to have some kind of autonomy, or to recognize that even if I'm attached, that I'm still seen as a self. There's this desire to not entirely be merged with, even though they may appreciate the blessings and the sensuality of a relationship. There's this desire to be still seen as an individual and to be seen as a self, and that I am worthy in and of myself without being attached to another. So those are some of the key qualities that I think of when I think of this archetype. And now we're going to move to the next archetype, which is the virgin become woman. And this particular archetype for me is deeply embedded in one of the Greek myths of Persephone. And for those of you who don't know about the myth of Persephone, it's a story of the loss of innocence and initiation into the underworld. And in the story arc of a Virgo, particularly Virgo risings, although you'll see these themes in different ways, if you have major Virgo placements like a Virgo Sun or a Virgo Moon, or other kinds of placements, there are ways where you see the story arc of Persephone and the transition from innocence into adulthood is very prominent in the myth. And so, key themes that are related to this myth, which I'm going to share with you in just a moment, are the loss of innocence and initiation into adulthood, the seed that is swallowed up by the earth and then germinates. We have, according with that, themes around death and rebirth and the journey into underworld type themes. And when I say underworld, I don't necessarily mean to pull in myths and archetypes from like Christianity when we think of hell. Although Hades is a key player in the myth of Persephone, and there is things related to the realm of the dead, but there is so much more to the realm of the underworld that the ancients ascribe to it than what we typically think of in the Christian archetype of heaven and hell. Um, the cycle of death and rebirth is actually a core theme for this part of Virgo's archetypes. There's also transitioning thresholds, and we see that with regards to the fact that Virgo is a double-bodied sign. We have the threshold of summer, and we carry the energy of summer up into a certain point, and then we cross the threshold of summer into autumn. And so there is this embodiment of seasons of life in this archetype of the virgin become woman, initiation into new seasons of life. And then lastly, the descent of the mind into the body. And I will talk a little bit more about that as we get into the myth, but I want to come back to a couple things. Um, you know, one of the things in the story arc of Virgo is this idea of transition from youth to adulthood. And when we think of the time of being a young man or a young woman, we associate that oftentimes with naivety, with maybe a kind of idealism, and the evolution that takes place, from that time where we have so much aspiration and dreams into adulthood, where some of that aspiration and idealism becomes tempered by reality, a more mature perspective. For example, how many of us can recognize, times in our life when we were young and we said things like, well, when I grow up, I'm going to do X and I'm going to do it this way. And there's this kind of sometimes this rejection of, the parent and the way that they do things. And sometimes that's legitimate. I'm not trying to say that that's wrong or incorrect, but there's also this quality that happens that when we transition into adulthood, some of our assumptions become tested. Some of our idealism gets faces opposition and challenge, and we learn that maybe it's not as simple as what we thought it was. And so the part of this archetype that relates to Persephone's journey into the underworld and the journey that she makes from youthfulness, the innocence, into womanhood and adulthood is related deeply to the gaining of a more mature, and I don't mean mature as in better than youth, but I mean mature as fuller perspective, one that is more inclusive because of experience, one that is less naive because of the movement of learning from a conceptual basis in the mind and an aspirational basis in the mind into embodiment that comes by virtue of experience throughout the lifetime. This descent is very, very symbolic to the descent that Persephone makes into the underworld. But it's also very astronomical because both of the signs of Mercury reflect the descent of the light. For Gemini, we are at a point of culmination where the sun's at its highest point in the sky near the Tropic of Cancer. And then the sun makes this turn and it begins its descent back down in the sky. And we experience the warmest, the brightest times of year, but the sun is still in the process of descending up until the point where we get to the equinox when the sun drops below um, the celestial equator and it begins moving down towards the Tropic of Capricorn and into the darkness. Virgo takes place right before that time. where we have equal day and equal night. And so for Virgo, this is the literal descent of the sun into darkness. And it's the time of year where that darkness exceeds the time of the daylight. And so the sun literally spends less time in the sky as it moves lower and lower towards the Tropic of Capricorn. This metaphorically symbolizes the illumination of the mind moving more into embodiment, moving more into actuality and experience and maturity or fullness, rather than thinking of it as, like I said, bad or contrasting with immaturity. It's literally going from thinking we know to actually we know. And that's more of an embodied quality of knowledge. So as we dive into the story of Persephone, um, we're going to see what happens as she is literally swallowed up by the earth and then enveloped in the underworld. So let's dive into that story for those of you who aren't familiar with it. So the myth of Persephone and Hades goes a little bit like this, and there's a few variances in the accounts, but fundamentally, this is how it goes. Hades, who is the brother of Zeus, asks secretly for Persephone's hand in marriage. Zeus is Persephone's father. Demeter is the mother of Persephone, and Demeter is a goddess of agriculture. And Zeus agrees and doesn't consult Demeter. He doesn't consult her mother. It's hilarious because there's so many ways where um, Greek myth shows these kinds of faux pas. But basically, Demeter and Persephone were out walking in the fields, and Persephone was away from her mother, and she was in a field, and these daffodils spring up. I think it was narcissus, or maybe it was another flower. And when she reached down to pluck the flowers from the earth, a void appeared in the earth, and Hades, with his chariot of horses, scoops up Persephone and steals her away to the underworld. Meanwhile, Demeter's kind of going about her business, and then when she goes to find Persephone, she can't find Persephone. Panic begins to set in, and she realizes something's terribly wrong, and she begins wandering the earth for 9 days, according to the myth, looking all over for her daughter, high and low, and her grief and her anxiety is becoming more and more potent by the day and amplified. On the 10th day, it says that Hecate, the moon goddess, and Helios, the sun god, interesting, the two luminaries, informed Demeter that Persephone was actually abducted by Hades. And you can see this shift in the myth, just like we would see with any mother, right? The shift from fear and anxiety of like not knowing what had happened to rage and mama bear mode. And in her anger, Demeter begins threatening things. She begins withholding the fertility of the earth. No crops begin to grow. Famine is threatening, and the human race is literally suffering from Demeter's wrath. She is literally preparing to go to war for her daughter. And Zeus, like a chicken, sends Hermes, Mercury, to go negotiate with Demeter because he knows he's in the wrong. He didn't talk to Demeter when he said it was okay for Persephone to marry Hades. And so Zeus is totally like chickening out. And so he's sending Mercury to go talk with Demeter. Well, as the myth goes, with this time had passed, it sounds, um, we could take this very literally. 9 days isn't a long time. For a mother that's lost her child, 9 days would feel like an eternity, or 10 days would be like an eternity. But for the agricultural impacts, we know that 10 days may or may not make a huge impact on things stopping growing, or for famine to erupt so suddenly. So there's some, take it with a grain of salt. But there's this passage of time that's implied. And meanwhile, Persephone is with Hades and adapts to the underworld. And here's where we see some variances in the myth. Some parts of the myth say that Persephone was kept against her will, and she resented being with Hades, and that Hades even raped her. Other versions of the myth describe a different story, that she actually adapted to the underworld and she fell in love with Hades. And so the quality of resistance is different based on, the different stories that are told. But fundamentally, we know that Persephone adapts to the underworld. While she's there, she eats of a pomegranate. And in the ancient myths, the pomegranate was a really significant fruit. It was seen as a sensual fruit. It was full of seeds, which was a picture of fertility and masculinity, and um, it was very sexual. Um, it was also symbolic that when you ate something in the underworld, it bound you to the underworld for eternity. And so here's Persephone adapting to the underworld. She eats of a pomegranate, which is a metaphor of, she engages in relationship with Hades. She begins to form an attachment to Hades. And with that, there is this transition from virgin to woman, someone who is agnostic of sexuality to someone who experiences sexual fullness or completion and sensual pleasure. Um, Literally, you can think back to your own experiences with this, and you literally go from not knowing what sexuality is like to knowing. So in this same way, we see this quality of transition from innocence, naivety, girlishness or boyishness to adulthood. And this is a key part of this archetype. And with that transition, we see Persephone beginning to grow into and adapt to her role now as queen of the underworld. Meanwhile, Demeter, in her anger and in her rage, challenges Zeus and Hades and begins negotiating with them because she wants her daughter back. And Zeus is pressuring Hades, like, you got to make a deal. Otherwise, the earth is going to be laid waste. There will never be light again. The humans will starve. And so they strike a deal that Persephone will return to the earth to be with her mother for 6 months of the year. And she will spend 6 months in the underworld, half of her time in the upper world and half of her time in the underworld. And this is how the Greeks began to create a mythopoetic worldview of spring and summer. Because spring and summer, when the world wakes up and then the flowers fruit and the animals give birth to their young, and we have all the anticipation of life returning and the sun um, gaining strength, that is the time that Persephone would return to Demeter and they would spend time in the upper world and the earth would flower. And then in the autumn and the winter, when the days would darken, is when Persephone would return to the underworld and the earth would experience cycles of dormancy and decay as Demeter began to experience grief and sadness. And so this has got very interesting symbolism when you take a big step back and you think about it, not only around the progression of innocence to fullness, but also just this beautiful mythopoetic worldview of why do we have the seasons, and a way that the ancients saw, the rationale behind that. And we begin to understand some of the melancholy that would set in when Persephone would return to the underworld and the days of light were over. So, what qualities can we understand about the sign of Virgo from this myth, this beautiful myth and archetype? There's so much that we can draw from the story of Persephone and Hades. There is this axis with Virgo that embodies the loss of innocence, but also the development of an appreciation for the privileges and pleasures of adulthood. And this is symbolized by Persephone's eating of the pomegranate, which both bound her to Hades, but was also deeply symbolic of the embrace of sexuality, fertility. Hence, the virgin is just not a virgin anymore. We see that in the acceptance of change and initiation from innocence to adulthood. We've talked a little bit about the astronomical significance of the sun moving from a place that's high in the sky and its transition lower in the sky, and that's symbolic of the initiation of things that are in the mind into the body, and the quality of, we know in part in theory here, but then we know in practice as we engage in experimenting with life, experimenting with those ideals, letting those ideals be tested against adversity. With the innocent archetype, we see a quality of prudence and conscientiousness, almost like, oh, I probably shouldn't eat that pomegranate, or I probably shouldn't be thinking about these things, but there's this pull to the underworld. Persephone is abducted into underworld themes, and the underworld is not only a place where the dead live, but the underworld is the shadow. It's the place of shadow. It's the place of worldly knowledge and wisdom. And so we see this journey from naivety into worldly knowledge and wisdom, sensuality. If you stay forever in the mind, you are absent in some ways from the experience of the physical body. And so part of the myth of Virgo is actually shifting from some of that rigidity, from the ideals and the associations of the mind into actual physical um, experience. And that being a quality of completion or growth or gaining of wisdom. Um, and because we're dealing with real life, real experiences. Um, you can see also within this archetype these kind of youthful ideals and convictions that are kind of related to that idealism, and the shift into the underworld to a radically different perspective, perhaps even an upside down perspective, where you're forced to reconcile what you believed based before you knew physically about things. Now you know in actuality. There's this compare, contrast. There's this quality of like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be, and my perspectives changed. So there's this descent from conviction and kind of rigidity into flexibility, uncertainty. Well, maybe it wasn't that way. Maybe I could loosen up a little bit here. There's this ability to identify, and how many of you can relate to this? I know I can, that the older I get, though sometimes the more the less certainty I have about the way that things are in the world. Some of my ideals and convictions have been tested, and I've seen them from different perspectives and angles, and it challenges me to go, this is far more complicated than I ever imagined. And that ability to identify the fact that things are not just singularly one way, but there is actually great complexity, and there is facets and perspectives to understand and encounter, helps break down that quality of rigid conviction into more flexibility, uncertainty, curiosity, the willingness to acknowledge that things are complicated and not black and white. And some of that black and white quality is where Virgo begins, with being a little bit judgmental, maybe a little bit rooted in preconceived ideas that maybe are immature or naive, but then they, through the process of initiation into worldly knowledge or worldly experience or underworld type experiences, those fixed ideas then begin to shift in the same way that the fixed energy of summer shifts into the energy and the initiation into fall, into darkness. And it's just a beautiful way that you see, the quality of light and the seasons speak to very real realities that are a part of this archetype. That's why I love studying the myths and studying digging into this stuff because it's so rich when you begin to think about how this relates to the human soul and how this relates to this particular part of the zodiac. Um, we also see the journey from idealism into imperfection. That's part of that journey that I just was talking about. And there's also this thing that gets activated in Virgos that I think is this instigation of the perpetual learner, where curiosity, you know, begins to lead us into paths of further initiation and further cycles of the death of an idea and the rebirth of an idea. The journey from unenlightenment to enlightenment, the initiation of the soul into mysteries and into secret knowledge. There's something oracular about this, about the transition of a Virgo, and the recognition that growth is actually a series of many deaths and rebirths. And when you understand Mercury's cycle, the ruler of Virgo, Mercury as a planet, because of its cycle with the sun, goes through the death and rebirth cycle more often than any other planet. Every time we have a retrograde, Mercury goes through a death and rebirth cycle twice. It goes through Cazimi, both, which is the moment of conjunction with the sun, that seed moment, where it burns up in combustion, comes to the heart of the sun, is reborn, and then goes through recovery. It goes through that twice. It goes once by direct motion, and then it retrogrades, and it goes through it again by indirect motion. And so that process is a picture of the way that a Virgo will go through these processes of death and rebirth of ideas and introduction to ideas and enlightenment over and over and over and over again. And it's this beautiful symbolism, but it speaks to that quality of constantly learning, constantly going from not knowing to knowing, having ideas be tested, broken down, built back up, and reconstructed. One of the things that I want to not neglect before I finish this archetype is that there's also a quality here with the story of Persephone and Hades, that we see themes that are reminiscent of Beauty and the Beast. And how many of you are familiar not only with maybe the Disney movie, but maybe the old tale, the fairy tale? But in the fairy tale, we see the maiden represented by Beauty, and the innocence, and she is held against her will by the beast in his castle. And just like Persephone was with Hades, we also see in that journey that the presuppositions that Belle has with the beast, that they begin to shift and change, and she begins to learn about the character of the beast. She learns about who he was, the good and the bad and the ugly. And there is this character arc that you see with this particular archetype of falling in love with something that we initially judge to be ugly or bad, but with time, curiosity, and learning what's real, learning the actual. Again, here we have the preconceived idea, and then we have the journey into the actual. That curiosity in that journey into the underworld becomes a thing of beauty. And we see the rescue of the beast and the transformation of the beast into the prince. And so for Virgos, this story arc of judgment, preconceived ideas, to the shift of learning and actual experience and the transformation and the initiation that comes from that is very real. And we see it repeated in the story arc of the Beauty and the Beast. It's the movement from intense morality and ideas and idealism to falling in love with our darkness and our shadow and the way that that transforms us. Love it. So let's talk about our third myth, the cunning blacksmith. And this one may feel a little bit strange because for many of us, we've heard maybe the reference to, the maiden become woman, or we've heard of the harvest maiden. But this one actually comes from the second decan of Virgo. And the decans were another dignity scheme that originated from ancient Egypt in the way that they saw astrology. And there were certain rulers for every 10 degrees of a sign. And there were symbols that were associated with each of those decans. The second decan of Virgo, the symbol was the hammer and the anvil. And as I've been studying that decan, it reminded me very much of the story in the Greek myth of Hephaestus and Aphrodite or Venus. And this is a very interesting myth, and I think it pulls some interesting archetypes into um, the way that we can understand Virgo. And just because I don't know if this is less prominent, but this is, to me, it still resonated very strongly with this myth and the nature of a Virgo. So I'm excited to kind of unfold this for you today. But Hephaestus was a blacksmith. He was the god of craftsmanship and fire who was married to Aphrodite or Venus as we know her. Hephaestus was devoted. He was diligent. He was loyal. He was always sort of working in his workshop. He was crafting things. He was very inventive. He was dedicated and masterful and wise in his craft. As we look into the story of Hephaestus and Aphrodite, here's some interesting details. Hephaestus was a loving, loyal husband who was matched to Aphrodite by Zeus. Here we go, Zeus doing his own thing again. Hephaestus was not handsome. He was considered by some reports as less ugly. I like to think of it maybe as more common. And based on some early childhood experiences, he had deformed legs. So there was this aspect where physically he was not beautiful. One day, as he was going to his workshop, I don't remember exactly how the story goes, but Hephaestus learns that Aphrodite is having a torrid affair with Ares or Mars while he was away at his workshop. And here is where we begin to see some key characteristics, I think, of Virgo. So instead of just going into rage mode and physical kind of anger, we see the craftiness of Hephaestus. So he immediately goes into his workshop and he creates an invisible, magical, unbreakable net. He forges it and he sets a trap for his adulterous wife and her lover. And he pretends to leave for a trip. Notice the planning. Notice the craftiness. Notice the forethought. Then, when Ares and Aphrodite or Venus met to indulge in their steamy love affair, the net falls on them and bound them, and it fully exposed them in their lovemaking. Hephaestus returns. He then calls all the gods and goddesses of Olympus together to witness the couple's betrayal, and he makes them a public spectacle. Very, very interesting story. And here is where, to me, the second decan of Virgo and the hammer and the anvil is like a subtle cue to this myth and how it relates to the nature of a Virgo. So, Virgo qualities and character developments that I think we can reasonably ascribe to this story come from a sense of Virgos tend to be very loyal. They tend to be very dedicated and severe in judgment if they're betrayed. They lead with, generally speaking, with loyalty and dedication. There is this quality of intelligence and discernment that, again, we see in the archetype of this myth with Hephaestus, and the nature of a Virgo being very discerning of character and having a quality of, like, I'm weighing your soul. I'm weighing the choices that you make. I'm looking at the things that you do and I'm making judgments about your character. There's this conscientiousness and attention to morality. And I think from Hephaestus, who's a blacksmith, he was a master craftsman. We see this attention to detail. We see that his renown as a worker, and the things that he made, the inventions that he created were incredibly transformative. They were innovative and brilliant. Um, but there was also this quality that when his discernment was triggered, he began to investigate. He began to look into the details. There was clear mental analysis and problem solving about how he was going to deal with his wayward wife and her lover. And there was no small amount of cunning and wit in the way that he dealt with them. You know, he laid a trap. He pretended, he played upon their deceitfulness and said, "Oh, I'm going to go away for a trip. I'll be back." And he lured them into a place where their morality would be plain to see for everyone, um, or their lack of morality would be plain to see. So there's this use of intellect and strategy over raw might and power. Because have you ever seen a blacksmith, people? They are incredibly muscular and tough, and the way that they wield hammer and tolerate heat and deal with things that are strong, like metals and steel and things like that, they are buff. If you've ever met a blacksmith, you know that they're not wimps. Could Hephaestus have gotten into, a fight physically with Ares? Maybe. Ares was also the god of war. He didn't have deformed legs. But here we see in this myth that Hephaestus chose to wage war by intellect and strategy over raw might and power. There's something about Hephaestus too that loved craft, loved making tools, using tools, making things useful for people, creating efficiency, a well run forge, creating tools that helped make daily work and things better and easier, or innovating around problems. And you will find that in the character of a Virgo, that there is this intellectual side and love of craft many times, hobbies, attention to detail. In fact, one of the tarot cards that comes to mind when I think of this myth and also the nature of a Virgo is the Eight of Pentacles. And in the Eight of Pentacles, you see, a young apprentice, and he's bent over with a hammer and a chisel, and he's chiseling very intentfully this design into one of the coins. And it's repetitive and it's the same for each one. And he's got a stack of completed coins, and he's got a couple that he's still working on. And that card often connotes things around craftsmanship, attention to detail, diligence, and we find those characteristics very synonymous with a Virgo and definitely with Hephaestus in this myth. There's a love of industriousness and trade and good exchange. When you think about a blacksmith, a blacksmith makes tools, gets paid for services, barters. They are a part of a thriving economy, and that is very synonymous with Mercury. Mercury rules things related to finances and exchange and merchants and things. So we see that part of Mercury's significations here in the sign of Virgo with this myth. And then also the ability to break things down into raw components and to alchemize them in a new and innovative way. Again, here is where we see the analytical and intelligence of Virgo, being able to break things into their component parts and to build them back together in a new or improved way, or the way that a blacksmith does, melting metals and cooling them and forging them into useful tools. It's an alchemical kind of process that leads to innovation and forward movement, and that is very synonymous with a Virgo. So I think one of the things that I want to finish with before we transition to our next archetype is just a couple additional insights. And this is just a wondering of mine, but I sometimes wonder, with the proximity of the sign of Virgo to Venus's home sign of Libra, is just sort of another synchronicity speaking to this myth of Hephaestus and Aphrodite. Because in the sign of Virgo, Venus is actually in poor dignity. She is in her fall. So it's not natural for Venus to be high strung, diligent, kind of working constantly. She far prefers to be relaxed, harmonious, agreeable, um, playing and partying and doing recreational things and indulging in pleasure. And Virgo's practical nature sort of struggles to embody Venusian pleasure. And so it's interesting to me that Venus's temple in Libra, which has this mental appreciation for pleasure and art and creativity, is right next to Virgo or in aversion to the sign of Virgo. And there's this kind of way that Virgo may approach craft and art from a more intellectual perspective or a scientific kind of a perspective, but Venus approaches it more from an aesthetic and a recreational and a pleasure-based perspective. And that's why Venus struggles when she's in Virgo, and why we might have seen this kind of quality of tension in the relationship between Hephaestus and Aphrodite, because they were a little bit like oil and water. Similarly, on that note, Hephaestus was practical. He was hardworking. He was a craftsman. His creativity and his genius were like a quality of intellectual craftsmanship and renowned amongst Olympians. And while it was a kind of art and it inspired people, it was art that was achieved through genius and innovation and usefulness and resourcefulness. And like I mentioned, it's very reminiscent of that Eight of Pentacles in the tarot. Hephaestus certainly was not dashing or handsome like Ares or Mars, but he was common, he was loyal, he was dedicated, and kind of an unlikely match for Aphrodite. In fact, some myths portray Aphrodite Venus as being resentful of her match to Hephaestus. It just further emphasizes that sometimes there's this quality about Virgos of feeling awkward or unsure in love, or showing love through service and being dutiful and loyal, versus kind of the hot-blooded and embodied passion and fiery infatuation of Mars or Aries, which is just not common for somebody that's a little bit more mental, right? Um, there is this journey then that we see for the Virgo, that maybe that fiery, hot-blooded, embodied passion shifts as the mind shifts from a more mental perspective about relationship into an embodied perspective about relationship. And we see that in the relationship of Persephone, who learns to savor the delights of the body, which is pictured when she eats the pomegranate, falls in love with Hades, and ultimately agrees to stay as the queen of the underworld. And so, we see that again, this picture of naivety, mentalness, um, kind of that shift into embodiment, wisdom. And so I'm not here to say that Virgos can't be passionate. Please don't take that as a way. I think Virgos can be incredibly passionate. I think that when they make that transition from the mental idealism and the assumptions about how things work into actually living more from an embodied perspective, they can be some of the most passionate and devoted people ever. So there's really cool things, I think, from this myth of Hephaestus and Aphrodite, and I hope that you've enjoyed it, because I think it's a little bit less common that we don't see this talked about more. And it comes from that second decan of Virgo with the hammer and the anvil. All right, we're rounding the corner with our last archetype, the Maiden of Morality. So our fourth and final archetypal myth is the Maiden of Morality, which illuminates the association of Virgo with two goddesses of morality and justice from Greek myth, Astraea and Dike. And the constellation of Virgo is actually associated many times with a maiden. There's some versions wherein she's holding the wheat sheaf in one hand and she's holding the scales of Libra in another, or she's just sometimes holding the scales of Libra. And the constellation is therefore associated with the myth of these two Greek goddesses. Astraea and Dike were goddesses of virtue and morality. They both were, very symbolic around themes of truth, fairness, moral order, and the way that morality governs society. And there is some reference with these goddesses to kind of the herald qualities of Mercury, or kind of the virgin prophet, the oracle, are announcing kind of prophetic judgment and decrees because truth is prophetic and illuminatory. In these myths, both Astraea and Dike walked on the earth. They were observers of the behaviors of humanity. They were chaste, they were moral, they were virtuous, they were discerning. Notice similarities to other Virgo archetypes. In these stories and myths, both Astraea and Dike reported human injustices. They were observing them while they would walk around on Earth looking like mortals, and then they reported these to Zeus for judgment. As mankind grew more and more corrupt, the goddess, in disgust with humanity, left the earth. And instead of walking among the earth, she chose to make her home in the night sky, becoming a constellation and carrying the scales of justice in shared association with the sign of Libra. And I wonder a little bit with this archetype about the human behaviors and the happenings being reported to Zeus, almost like the informant. And it reminds me a little bit of this quality of Mercury dealing in secrets. Um, and sometimes, whether or not, if there is a strong Mercury in somebody's chart, this can be kind of a significator of like somebody who's involved with investigative journalism, who covers news, the happenings of humanity through media, or writing about the events of humanity in an either very factual kind of way, or even sometimes putting a spin on it editorially. I think of careers and things like court reporting, where we are literally documenting every little single detail to the nines. There's court level facts that are being documented and used in justice cases for justice, very associated with the myth of Astraea and Dike. And I also think about this in relationship of people who study the law as if they're seeking to define and clarify what the law is speaking to, interpreting it, understanding what it pertains to and what it doesn't. The quality of analysis, breaking it down, differentiating it, looking for precedent. These are all very Virgo qualities. And I think sometimes we just lump them automatically into Libra, because of Libra being the sign of the scales. But I think there are many people who are probably involved in legal professions that have strong Virgo placements and that have that detailed analytical mind where they're really trying to split hairs, and the argumentation, or the way that cases are presented, is very mercurial, actually, versus Venusian. If you think of Venusian, it's diplomatic, it's working to make peace. A Virgo isn't going to work to make peace. A Virgo is going to present exactly why they're right. They're going to argue their case, and they're going to give you a bajillion details about why they're right and why it should be. They're going to substantiate it. If you've ever gotten involved in an argument with a Virgo, it's like you get an arsenal of detail backing up their claims. And so I think that there's something to really pay attention to with this archetype about the very detailed, critical thinking orientation of a Virgo, and the relationship of a Virgo's values and sense of need for equity and justice and fairness, that is a part of this sign, you know. Also, Mercury loves secrets, and we see that throughout all of the myths and the stories where Mercury is relating to the gods. And the myth of Estrella and Psyche to me also speaks to the investigation of secrets and the divulging of secrets in high or secret places for judgment of character. And here we see the moral qualities of Virgo kind of in play. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what qualities about Virgo might we associate with this archetype. And here is where we see the sharp conscientiousness of the Virgoan personality, the tendency towards moral judgment, and the value for moral purity and conscience. Why is it? Is it because they are high and mighty? No, because the myth of Estrella and Psyche was they wanted community to be fair and equitable and moral. They wanted relationships and the ways that people work together to be governed by good law, good moral, community kind of values. And that's where I think you see some of this alignment with Virgo is there's this implication of what happens when we don't abide by those things and the consequences of that, and the need to enforce things that were related to equity, balance. It's because of the awareness of the shadows of what happens when those rules aren't abided by, and the judgment, therefore, on how we address situations of failure. One of the things that I think people most commonly recognize about the sign of Virgo is the emotional and mental struggle with failure, criticism, guilt. Many people with Virgo placements refer to experience where they recognize that I have a really critical inner voice that sometimes I struggle with. And that desire and that self-criticism is very improvement oriented. It it isn't just about being harsh for the sake of being harsh. It's because there's the aspiration to be better. And so you find with Virgos many times there's this deep internal sensitivity to self-criticism, harsh attitudes, being unable to kind of process failure, or needing to work through it and recognize that in spite of failure, that they are still worthy. I think that that's a really big thing, and I think shame can be a really big deal for Virgos when they make that shift from maybe an inner value that they thought they had into the underworld of realizing, oh, I'm imperfect like everybody else, you know, and I actually need to relax my judgment not only towards other people, but I actually need to give myself grace. And there's this desire to not be incompetent, to not be looked at as less than, um, and the tendency to maybe ruminate around guilt for mistakes. And here also is where we see kind of this steadfast determination to learn from mistakes and to do better, to rise from fallenness and to overcome personal failings. This can be a big thing for the story arc of a Virgo, is learning to balance perfectionism and to engage in improving one's path, one's way, one's character, the meticulous care and cultivation of character, learning, trying to understand why did I behave that way, the weighing of motives and actions and breaking that down. What was it about that that made me behave that way? And sometimes the ways that we're shocked and surprised at some of our own shadows. There is that quality with Virgo of wanting to break that down, to process it so that they can move forward in a better way and be aware of why I don't want to do that again. And that relates to Virgo's desire to learn, to self-improve. And consequently, I think it's also interesting why Virgo is opposite of Pisces. And we're in a Virgo Pisces cycle right now with the eclipse season. And so we're seeing themes related to this. And Pisces has such a beautiful orientation because it's a Jupiter sign towards surrender and grace and forgiveness and being able to take in kind of the hard realities of the world. And there's this struggle to deal with that, but there's always this reaching for the light, this reaching for grace, reaching for divine forgiveness, and oneness. And these are actually the virtues that Virgo craves, the ability to sometimes release that need for continuous improvement and to just be uh, okay and worthy as one is, to surrender the intellectual criticism to mercy and to be able to receive a compliment, to rest and to actually take in unconditional love. So you can see with the archetype of Virgo, there is these sharp qualities that are very mercurial. We also see here themes again related to discernment of character, weighing of motives and actions, and the need to make factual or true or perfect accounts of details and circumstances. So that wraps up our 4 archetypes that give us some insight and illumination into the zodiac sign of Virgo. I want to talk a little bit now about how you can apply today's learning to your own natal chart. So there's many ways you can do that, and this isn't meant to be an exhaustive class on how to, you know, delineate or create meaning around planetary placements, but here's some simple suggestions. If you have Virgo placements in your natal chart, um, consider the base nature of any planet that is in Virgo, and then consider how that planet might behave in Mercury's sign based on what you've learned about these kinds of archetypes today. So um, I would I would spend some time with that, journal about that a little bit, really sit back and contemplate like what is the core nature of, say, Venus in Virgo's sign. How does Venus behave when she's in her home signs? Now, let's put a filter. Think of like an Instagram filter, and you're putting on a Mercury overlay, a Virgo overlay, and think about that. Think about how that kind of might feel uncomfortable for Venus. Think about how that might change how she shows up. Maybe do a study on people who have Venus in Virgo. One person that comes to my mind is Martha Stewart. You see that intense, detailed quality of Virgo and the intentionality behind every little thing. Also, the master of trade. Like Martha Stewart has built an empire around beautifying the home and a line of products and cleaning and everything. I mean, think about how Virgos love to clean. Have you seen how many times a Virgo will wash their hand in the course of cleaning? Like, here's a great example of, you see Venus in a sign that she's normally not comfortable in, but in Martha Stewart's life, this is definitely a strength, you know. Another example might be Mars in Virgo. Mars in Virgo would be kind of the consummate strategist, the one who brings diligent fire and inspiration and strategy, and also perhaps craftsmanship, like deep attention to detail and working with fire and working with, art and creating it passionately. Um, I even think of things like how art is also a statement against society and what society believes. Think about a Mars and Virgo getting spicy with its art and holding up the mirror to society. You know, these are some different ideas about that. You can determine if you have any planetary placements in Virgo just by looking at your chart, or if you're a Virgo ascendant, one important thing would be to consider where Mercury is placed in your chart for insight, because where Mercury is, if you're a Virgo ascendant, it will import some of those flavors from that part of the zodiac into how you behave as a Virgo. For example, I'm a Virgo rising with Mercury in Libra. And so I'm a little bit less analytical and I'm a little bit more poetic and storytelling and creative. And I'm definitely more of a diplomat than I am um, kind of embodying some of the more mercurial parts of these archetypes. Just a good way for you to think about how where a chart ruler is can also change, how these archetypes are represented in the life of your chart. Um, a great resource that I have found for helping you understand some of these planetary pairings is Ren Butler's book, The Archetypal Universe. And it is a fantastic resource where he kind of talks about each of the planets on their own. And then he talks about planetary pairings and sometimes even gives you ideas about when there are three planets that are involved. And it's not zodiac specific, but it is planet specific. And so you can look at the universal meanings of what each planet is and rules and speaks to, and that can give you some inspiration about how to think about your chart. Um, of course, if you're feeling overwhelmed, astrology is a deep and complex, sacred practice. And that is why we are here as astrologers, is to help kind of break things out for you. And every natal chart is different. And I will tell you that it's really important to sometimes consider the uniqueness of a natal chart because it's not a one size fits all by any stretch. That's the beauty of astrology, is there are things that are both universally true and sometimes individually you see differences. And so working with an astrologer can be a really great tool for helping you understand the promises of your natal chart and the planets and the signs that they fall into. To wrap up today, I just want to say thank you so much for joining me for this journey into the science and myths of Virgo. I really hope that you've enjoyed it. If today's video inspired you and you want help understanding your natal chart, you can go to my website, WisdomTreeAstrology.com, and you can book a reading with me there. There's a whole host of different kinds of readings that I do. Also, for more insights and inspiration to support your spiritual practice, I'd invite you to consider becoming a member of the Wisdom Tree Patreon, where we have regular audio podcasts, blog style posts, sometimes suggested rituals that you can practice to support your spiritual journey, insights and practices with tarot, crystal healing, dream work, and more. Lastly, if you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. Leave me a comment. Love to answer some of your questions. And you can follow me on Instagram for other news announcements and astro tidbits at WisdomTree Astrology. Thanks so much for watching.